What needs to be strong to be fast? So we're going to look at what's going on from a muscular standpoint when we run fast, what muscles are working, what aren't, all based on new research and what we can do to improve that in the weight room. Of course, I'm always going to start with my history, my context. So how we've been looking at this for a while, it's going to start back to the fact that in 1976 we didn't medal. In 72 we didn't do great either, and so people are going to want to start to figure out why we're losing in the Olympics when we should be dominating the sprints. So you're going to have a series of research that shows different things based on the equipment and the technology they had at the time, and they're going to come down to strength. 89 power patterns of the leg during recovery phase, that muscles do work that help stride rate and stride frequency, which is why we started lifting weights. I think the big changers are Peter Weyand with vertical force, his work in vertical force in the early 2000s, and Ken Clark and Peter Weyand with his with his mass spring model theory to show how we spring ourselves down the track. But since then, there's been some interesting research that's come to light, both Chinese. How joint torques affect hamstring injury risk in sprinting, swing, stance, transition, and joint torque and mechanical power of lower extremities and its relevance to hamstrings during strain during sprints. So they're looking at a different way of figuring out why hamstrings pop. And you can look at both of the journals, and they're both dealing with medicine. I think the Journal of Healthcare Engineering is just kind of a cool title in itself, because they're looking at things from an engineering physics standpoint rather than an NSCA strength standpoint. And here's what they both came up with. This is the magic equation. So you are looking at the net, which is all the torque components acting on a joint, and here are all the things that come into play with your muscles. First of all, you just have your muscles doing work, which is joint muscles that are torquing to try to create power. And where this gets a little tricky is the fact that there's all kinds of research all over the place about the role of strength in sprinting. Some is positive, most is negative, but there's no real reason to figure that out where that is the sole reason why someone runs fast. Again, from a physics standpoint, you have to bring gravity into it. So not only are you fighting gravity from pulling you down, but also the effect gravity has on your joints when you swing them around, which is kind of why the Lila exogen stuff is so interesting, because you are now dealing with that part of the equation. Then you have your ground reaction force. So now how is your body reacting to hitting the ground with the force that it is? In some cases, anywhere from 3 to 8 times your body mass, depending on where your foot hits. Then lastly, I think the most interesting one is how fast are your limbs moving? That is the MDT. How fast are your limbs moving around, creating angular velocities and angular accelerations, and how that impacts the ground to move your mass forward. So again, we're looking at this from a different physics standpoint rather than a weightlifting strength standpoint. And of course, they're going to throw in a new equation for muscle power as well, where again, we are looking at the angular velocities of limbs as they move around when we move. So now, stuff like Ken Clark's paper on tangential velocity, your whip from the hip, and judging how fast people run make a lot more sense. I mean, it always made sense to me, but now it's how fast can you bring that leg into the ground, not stomping down, which creates a lot more issues with force coming into the ground, but pulling yourself through. He had a paper in just recently about foot speed coming into the ground with Chris Mang. And 2022, again, hip torque is the link between max velocity and acceleration. Again, it's how fast can that leg come into the ground. And then you start adding in these other factors that we've seen previously in the equation, and it's starting to make a lot more sense. I think one of the reasons why Ken went this way is he started looking at robotics. Last year alone, they spent $8 billion on robotics. And they spent $78 million on gait research, most of which went to robotic limbs for veterans. So if you want to follow good science, you're going to follow the money. And I think that's why Ken kind of led into that way. In fact, we've both been looking at a lot of robotic papers. I think part of it is the idea that with robots, you have fixed variables. Like how much can the hip move? How much can these different limbs move? Can you stabilize the different aspects to really focus on what makes you faster? And here's his work. When that leg hits the ground, you have to move your hips over that point. The faster the runner, the faster you're going to cover that distance. Your angular velocity, meaning how fast you can spin a giant circle, is going to be greater the faster you bring that leg into the ground. Your foot will get off the ground faster because the mass is moving over the top at a higher velocity. Again, that's what we call tangential velocity, is how fast that leg comes in the ground to bring your hips over that point. So again, to sum up, the faster the runner, the faster their legs move. And it's more than just a traditional weight room thing. So from his paper, one commonality between the two distinct performance limits is that the hip requires torque capability for maximum propulsion during its initial contact or contact of initial acceleration, and 2, for repositioning of the legs during the swing phase of max velocity. So the repositioning of the legs is going to be getting them in position to reverse. So when your leg hits the ground, from a physics standpoint, it becomes a hinge. Your foot hits, you have to bring that mass over. And that's where the torque comes into play. So it's kind of like an inverted pyramid where something's got to move you forward over that one point. And so that is the torque that's going to be needed to bring you over the top. And as I said, you basically become a hinge. You have to get that mass over a fixed point. And here's where it gets tricky. When we go into the weight room, all of a sudden your traditional deadlift and squat movements are not looking like hinges. I know we may say hinge the hip in terms like that, but that doesn't actually mean moving a mass over a fixed point. I know your leg is fixed in the ground, but you're going to straighten up using a lot of different muscles rather than creating hip torque to bring you forward. Why have we done it in the past? Why did we like that in the past? Because it was easy to measure. I mean, there is a hip-dominant deadlift and a hip-dominant squat, but it doesn't create the torque that happens when you sprint, where you're bringing the mass past that midpoint. Now we're looking at things as a hinge from a physics standpoint or a bioengineering standpoint, which I think gives us a better insight into what's actually happening. So how do you impact a hinge? You can put less mass on a contact point. You can pull the mass over the fixed point faster. You can bring more speed of that hinge into the ground to pull that mass over faster. I think one key point is you've got to keep the mass above the hinge as rigid as possible. Otherwise, you're going to have vectors pushing you in other places. And you want to keep the center of mass as high as possible because that's how you can create more torque. It's a longer lever. So right off the bat, right away, this is kind of why we do leg swings. We want to increase the speed of that leg going back and forth. And not only is it that of swinging through, but it's going to be the thigh reversal at the peak flexion and extension. How fast can you reverse that momentum of the leg coming through? And if you look back at some of the other factors, you have to focus on keeping your torso as rigid as possible when you swing around. Otherwise, you've got mass that actually is going backwards. And you want to stay nice and tall when you swing it through. Again, so you're keeping everything in place. And I think one of the main things is reversing that thigh. How fast can you reverse it? And there's going to be science that comes up here that shows why that's so important. So real quick, as we get deeper into the physics, just a quick overview here. Angular acceleration is really how fast you can run the circle. If you have a giant circle all the way around, it's how fast you can move through there. Quite simply, I know it's much more complicated than that. If we can get through faster and the top number stays the same because we're only traveling 60 degrees, that is how you're going to improve that factor. And again, we're looking at this from Newton's second law of rotation. It's inertia and angular acceleration around the axis of the hip. And it can impact all phases of your sprint as well, as we will see as we get further into the presentations.